I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not. Three ships were coming up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hello, and welcome to... Wait, I don't say hello. I say hey. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'll be one of your hosts today. This is going to be part 2 of our now 3-part episode on the Battle of Lepanto. Before we jump in, we have 2 new patrons to thank. We would like to thank Furious Luddite and FizzBuzz 3000. So thank you for your support on Patreon. We are a little late getting the April patron content out, so we are going to be trying to put out a early May and late May set of bonus stuff. Just had a lot of stuff going on in April. Didn't get around to the bonus episodes. So speaking of us, here's Taylor. Taylor, how's it going?
Pretty good. Excited to record another part of this thing. I know it just became a 3-parter as we were kind of talking.
Yeah, it just wasn't feasible to squeeze everything into 2. I was kind of on the fence, and so I expanded out some things, and I guess I'd rather always expand than contract with these episodes. Content is always good in today's economy. What have you been up to since last time you recorded?
I have been working through a new book that just came out, actually, called The Wide, Wide Sea by Hampton Sides. And it follows the last voyage of Captain James Cook. It's pretty interesting.
His last voyage before he retired peacefully?
In Hawaii, yeah. It's really interesting, though. Learning a little bit more about him. Captain Bly's hanging around. He's one of the officers.
Is Bly pretty young at this point?
This is like 10 years before the bounty.
Okay, so not like a young guy.
The only reason I know that is because they have a native person that they drop off on I can't remember which island it is. It's near Tahiti, but it's not Tahiti. It's one of those islands, one of the French Polynesian islands.
Bougainville?
No, not that one either. But they drop him off, and when Cook comes back on his 3rd voyage, when Bly comes back with the bounty.
Hey, I know this guy.
Yeah, he's dead already, actually. So. He asks about him and is told he's dead.
Okay.
But it was a guy that spent like 3 or 4 years in England. I had never heard of this story. His name was Oh My. And he learned English, learned a lot of British customs. Basically, he was kind of just paraded around England for years. And he actually got to listen to King George talk to Parliament about a little insurrection in the United States. Well, what would be the United States? So it's kind of interesting seeing different snapshots of history come together, different, of a time period where we know a lot about the Revolutionary War. It's kind of interesting to think that there's a Polynesian person hanging out in London.
Yeah, I have the one Hampton Sides book in the Kingdom of Ice. I still have not read it, though.
That might be the next one I read, actually. What about you?
Reading-wise, I finished Africa's World War by Gerard Prunier. That was very good. And so I started reading another book specifically on the Rwandan genocide by, I believe the author's name is Laura Melvern. Because Africa's World War kind of starts with the Rwandan genocide already happened, and it goes into the aftermath of that. So I've started that. That's very good. I'm reading a book called The Vanished Imam by Fouad Ajami. It's about the life and influence of Shia cleric Musa al-Sadr in Lebanon and just kind of the Shia world in general. I first learned about him in Robert Fisk's book Pity the Nation on Lebanon. Musa al-Sadr was influential in Lebanon, particularly with the founding of the Shia group Amal, which is still around. And offshoots of Amal would go into the formation of Hezbollah. And Musa al-Sadr is a really interesting story because he's this big influential Shia cleric, and then in 1978, on a visit to Libya, he just disappears. And I think to this day, no one knows what happened to him. Probably foul play involved.
Right.
But so that kind of runs parallel, and it sort of plays into the a big belief among the Shia is the 12th Imam, the hidden Imam, who kind of is a sort of a messianic type figure. I'm still in the beginning of it, but I'm really enjoying reading it. One of the funny things is at the beginning, in like the foreword, the author is thanking different people for their contributions to the book. And one of the people, and this book is from 1986, one of the people that he thanks for his insight into Shia life in Iraq is Ahmed Chalabi.
That Ahmed Chalabi?
Yes. Yes. The one from Iraq, the one from Blowback, one of the main characters. And yeah, he's just thanked for reasons totally unrelated to, like politics or anything. So I'm interested to see. It was just like a funny name to be mentioned. And again, it's from 86. So like this is before the wider Western world really knows who that is, I would say. So it was just a very funny name that really jumped out at me. Also, the podcast-wise, the We Always Lie to Strangers podcast. It's a podcast about Ozarks folklore.
Interesting.
I love folklore podcasts, but this on Ozarks folklore is great because it's some of your typical folklore content, your cryptids, your tall tales, local legends, but it's also mixed in with some more modern folklore. We're always making more folklore as humans. The most recent episode is called the Osage Baptist Church IED incident. It was very good. I highly recommend it. It's a fairly new podcast. I think they have like a dozen episodes out, maybe more. Very, very good.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
But we have some lore of our own to get into here.
Yes, we do.
We finished part 1 of this now 3-part series. Last week, the Holy League fleet had been embarrassed at the Battle of Preveza by the Ottoman corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa. That conflict, the Third Ottoman-Venetian War, wrapped up in 1540, with Venice signing a pretty unfavorable peace treaty with the Turks. The next big thing, event-wise, in this sort of broad brush that we're painting with, would be the Siege of Malta, referred to as the Great Siege of Malta, because it's really, really big and important. So we'll do a very, very short summary of the Siege of Malta here, because we are going to look at it in more detail on one of our May bonus episodes.
Nice.
As Andrew Hess highlights in The Battle of Lepanto and its place in Mediterranean history, the tendency in European-based scholarship on the Ottomans is to view the Ottoman expansion in the 16th century just through the lens of Europe. So that is the empire's attempts to push through the Balkans. You think about the Ottomans in the 1500s, the 1600s, you're thinking about them fighting in places like Hungary, places like Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, eventually besieging Vienna. And what that often ignores is the empire's efforts to formalize its control over North Africa. So Hess writes,
Ottoman documents preserved in Istanbul for the province of Algeria show a thorough organization of this frontier region by the central administration in Istanbul.
Imperial papers recorded the assignment and transfer to military men of grants to collect taxes, the dismissal and appointment of Ottoman governors for Algeria, the establishment and organization of Janissary and Canon Corps, the adjudication of tax disputes, and a multitude of other matters.
But the consolidation of an Ottoman administration in North Africa and the economic integration of the Maghreb into the empire rested upon the ability of the Ottomans to reach North Africa by a sea route that ran past the Spanish frontier defenses at Malta, Sicily, and Tunis.
So here the Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta, re-enter our story for a bit. With a new Grand Master, Jean Parisot de la Valette.
Ew.
Malta had been an annoyance to the Ottomans for some time now. It had been a launch pad for maritime raids on Ottoman shipping, in particular those of the order's chief naval captain, Mathurin Romega. His last name is like an adopted name, so it might like a nickname, so it might be pronounced Romegas. It might just be a Greek name. I'm not sure. We can just call him Romegas because he's French and we don't care. In 1564, Romegas and his 5 galleys seized an Ottoman treasure galleon belonging to the chief eunuch of the Ottoman court, carrying 80,000 ducats worth of merchandise, headed for, where else? Venice.
It's just weird hearing the phrase Ottoman treasure galley. Like, I feel like I associate that with Spain.
Yeah, you think of like a treasure galleon being more of an open seas thing, but you do see them operating in like the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Some of kind of your big pirate stories actually happen in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and they're seizing Ottoman treasure fleets. So this galleon was taken back to Malta, where we're going to see it again in the bonus episode. It becomes a bit of a trophy for both sides. So later in the year, Romegas captured an Ottoman merchantman with a couple of noteworthy passengers on board. One of them was the governor of Cairo. The other was someone with a personal connection to the Sultan. This was the former nurse of Suleiman's daughter, Mirima, returning from her pilgrimage to Mecca. So she was quite an old lady by this time. One source said that she was 107. I think it's possible that's an exaggeration.
Right.
But it's someone who the Sultan would feel personally if something happened to them. Only a few days later, the governor of Alexandria was captured on his way to see the Sultan in Istanbul. So for both personal and professional reasons, Suleiman had apparently seen enough from the Knights of Malta and decided it was time for the island to join the empire. Barbarossa, who by this point, he had already retired and he had actually died in 1546. Just a nice peaceful end to a life of corsairing. Like that portrait that we tweeted the other day of Barbarossa holding the trident.
Yeah.
One reason I like that picture so much is that there's kind of a strange disconnect for this person who's, this famed pirate, this famed corsair, getting old. Like, that's not a job that lends itself to that often.
Yeah, you don't meet a lot of old pirates.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why it's such a cool painting. So Barbarossa, he had advocated for this way back in the 1530s. He had been pushing for this. In 1551, Turgut had reportedly appealed to the Sultan in person, saying,
"You will do no good until you have smoked out this nest of vipers."
So again, Siege of Malta, we will go into more detail in our $3 bonus episode for May, one of those. For us here today, the important thing about the Siege of Malta is that it failed. After a siege of nearly 4 months, in which the Hospitallers were pushed to the limit of their endurance, a relief force of about 8,000 Spanish and Italians arrived in September under the command of Don Garcia Alvarez de Toledo y Osorio, the Viceroy of Sicily. The Ottomans were routed, leaving upwards of 20,000 dead on Malta. Dang. Roughly half of the 500 Hospitallers were dead as well.
So really no one had a good time?
Not really. It really was kind of a last-minute, just in the nick of time relief. We mentioned it in the Armada episode, but one of the people involved in the relief of Malta in that fleet was Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz. Later, the Marquis of Santa Cruz. So, quoting here from Roger Crowley in Empires of the Sea.
For the first time in 40 years, Suleiman had received a major check in the White Sea. In the face of all previous experience, the ravelin of Europe had held, shielding the Christian shore from certain depredation. Malta had survived through a combination of religious zeal, irreducible willpower, and luck. In the process, La Valette had fired up all Europe.
And yes, those familiar with Malta will know that the capital of Malta is named Valletta. It is named after Jean de la Valette.
Interesting.
Because obviously most of the urban areas were totally destroyed in the siege. So afterwards, they built up basically a new city and they named it for La Valette. So now, after the Siege of Malta, we need to introduce some new characters, or really one big new character, I guess, at first. And that's a new sultan. On September 6th, 1566, this is just the year after the Siege of Malta, While on campaign in Hungary, at the siege of Szigetvar, Suleiman, the Magnificent, the Lawgiver, died in his tent at the age of 71.
It's pretty good for back then.
It is, for a guy who's pretty active also, like going out on campaign.
Being in his line of work.
Mm-hmm. Being the Sultan is a pretty dangerous job sometimes. 2 days later, the city fell to the Ottomans. And in typical Ottoman fashion, his death was immediately concealed from all but those closest to the Sultan, so that the succession could be effectively managed and arrangements could be made for his son Selim to take the throne.
By arrangements, are we still killing like all of the brothers and siblings of Selim at this point? Or did they? I can't remember. Have they kind of chilled with that?
A lot of that has already happened.
Okay.
At this point. All of the brothers who would be fighting for the throne are already dead.
Yeah. For those that don't know, like, it's very interesting the way that it happens. It's basically like whoever can get there first and kill their rivals gets to be Sultan.
And it was interesting reading about this because, you know, if the Sultan did have a favorite son that he wanted, you know, he preferred to take the throne, you know, that son would often be sent like to a really distant province so that like they weren't involved in the palace intrigues. They could be away from all of the stuff. And then that results in, you know, this mad dash for the capital, basically, once the Sultan is dead. From Roger Crowley in Empires of the Sea.
The new Sultan had survived the murderous selection process through the death or execution of his more talented siblings. No one had a high opinion of Selim. He was physically unprepossessing. He was lazy and unpopular with the army. The Janissaries referred to him as the Ox. He was said to be a drunkard.
The ambassadors filed back unfavorable reports.
By nature irascible and bloodthirsty, he is given to all kinds of carnal pleasures, and above all, he is a great wine lover.
Going from, you know, a guy who gets the nickname the Magnificent to a lot of his fiercest enemies to a guy who immediately is just like, no one respects this dude.
I feel like there's a strong chance that he was Suleiman's favorite because he was like the least threatening to Suleiman.
I don't know that he was Suleiman's favorite necessarily. I think he was just the last one that happened to be standing. I think he was unthreatening to the others enough that no one thought to assassinate him. I think it is literally just that. The chapter of Osman's Dream by Caroline Finkel, massive tome on the Ottoman Empire that I used. I have not read it cover to cover, but I used it in spots for references. She devotes a chapter to Selim where he's labeled the sedentary Sultan. Caroline Finkel, she writes,
he failed to embrace his new role with much energy when faced with the total responsibility of the Sultanate. The fear inspired by the ever-present threat of mutiny among his troops was matched by his fear of a coup during his absence from the capital. After he became Sultan, Selim never again traveled further from Istanbul than the royal hunting grounds at Edirne.
And that's like not super far. Like Edirne still today is in the European part of Turkey. So like that's not very far. So we have a new Sultan, but we have the same Venice. Quoting here from Lester J. Libby.
The Republic had long been unpopular in Europe, and had in particular suffered much from accusations of irreligion made during the struggle with Pope Julius in 1509. Suspicions of unorthodoxy in Venice were reinforced by the Senate's desertion of the Crusading Alliance in 1540.
The action revived older charges of willing collaboration with the common enemy of all Christians. These claims were not wholly unfounded.
Ambassadors and consuls at Constantinople would frequently report home that the Ottomans relied principally on them for dependable intelligence about the West. One envoy noted as a matter of course the absence of the typical European hostility towards Turkey among the people of the lagoons.
One of the things that Selim II had done upon accession to the Ottoman throne was to affirm the peace treaty with Venice that was already existing. After Preveza, Venice had essentially cut out of the Holy League and signed a peace with the Ottomans. kind of leaving the rest of them hanging, which is exactly what they suspected that Venice would do. So despite that peace treaty, the next section of the notes is called the Fourth Ottoman-Venetian War. This is sometimes referred to as the War of Cyprus. So we have to look at Cyprus's role in the Mediterranean. We mentioned in the last episode that the Ottomans had taken possession of Egypt, parts of North Africa, the Levant in 1517. So that, in addition to Anatolia, mainland Turkey, the Balkans, more and more of these islands in the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus kind of occupies an awkward position, being so far to the east there. The far eastern tip of Cyprus is only about 60 miles offshore from the coast of Syria. And kind of as a modern aside, what this reminded me of is in that book, in Robert Fisk's book, Pity the Nation, he talks about when things were getting at their worst in Beirut in the 80s. He and I think like 2 other Western reporters were operating out of Beirut. Most Western news agencies that were reporting, quote unquote, from Lebanon actually were just operating out of Cyprus and, flying in to do their news report and flying back out because it's so close. You could just do that. It's very, very close and would be very, very concerning, you'd think, for the Ottoman Sultan. Say, why is this not ours already?
Right.
So Cyprus had been part of the Byzantine Empire, then partially taken during the Arab conquest of the mid-600s. Keep that part in mind. That is going to be relevant later. For several centuries after that, it existed as kind of an area of shared rule between Christian and Muslim. The island reverted to Byzantine/independent rule for about 2 centuries until being conquered by Richard the Lionheart and ruled by the House of Lusignan until it was sold in 1489 to our friends, the Republic of Venice. The House of Lusignan, do you remember? We talk about Kingdom of Heaven quite a bit on this show.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the douchebag king? The one who really wants to start a war. He's like the big rival. He's Guy de Lusignan.
Yeah,
he's one.
I've killed him in Assassin's Creed.
Yes, he's in those too. He's one of those Lusignans. His family ends up being the kings of Cyprus after they, for obvious reasons, can't be kings of Jerusalem.
Cyprus today seems like one of those crazy places where the racism is probably just on like a different level because there's just some deep-seated things going on.
I know that North Cyprus is like an unrecognized state.
Yeah, I know they have some squabbles.
I think they're only recognized by Turkey.
That must be where all the Turkish Cypriots live.
Quoting here from Caroline Finkel in Osman's Dream.
Venice had ruled Cyprus since 1489, having been invited there to protect the last weak Lusignan kings against Ottoman attack. In those days, when Mamluk Egypt was a power to be reckoned with, Venice had paid Cairo an annual tribute for its most easterly possession, as it now paid the Ottomans. Friction between the Ottomans and Venice was never completely absent, but outright war was usually avoided.
So as we've talked about, for Venice, a lot of times, most of the time, it makes a lot more sense for them to just pay people off. They're not fighters, they're lovers in Venice. They would much rather pay for the privilege of keeping this area and just keep on doing their own thing. But Cyprus was not a good place to be under Venetian rule, as alluded to in part 1. We may not think about colonialism in the Mediterranean at this point in history, and like, by any strict definition, we'd say there's so many differences between this and what we think about with colonialism. But that is kind of what's going on here with the local population of Cyprus, which is largely Greek. The Republic of Venice took from Cyprus grain, wine, sugar, salt, and cotton. From Roger Crowley.
It was a one-way trade. Venice gave nothing back. The downtrodden Greek Cypriot peasantry were ruled corruptly and taxed viciously. They were poor beyond belief.
All the inhabitants of Cyprus are slaves to the Venetians, wrote the visitor Martin von Baumgarten in 1508, obliged to pay to the state 1/3 of all their increase or income. And which is more, there is yearly some tax or other imposed on them, with which the poor common people are so flayed and pillaged that they hardly have the wherewithal to keep soul and body together.
Nor was the tone of the island improved by its employment as a botany bay for the Republic's undesirables. Murderers and political dissidents were exiled to Famagusta to swell the population. It was, all in all, a recipe for nervous occupation.
As we'll see in the bonus episode with the Siege of Malta, when the Ottomans besiege Malta, they're fighting not just the knights, not just the Hospitallers. They're fighting essentially the entire population of the island.
Yeah, this kind of colonialism feels much more like what Spain was up to in South America versus like England and North America. Like, it doesn't feel like they want to stay. They just want to squeeze everything they can out of it.
They're very much sort of sectioned off, saying we're here to extract and absolutely nothing else. And that doesn't exactly make for a supportive populace. Mm-hmm. So what we'll see is when the Ottomans invade Cyprus, a lot of these people are at the soonest possible moment rising up against the Venetians, because why would they fight for Venice? Also interesting in that quote that it mentions that the poor common people are so flayed and pillaged. That is not the only time that someone will be flayed in this series of episodes on Cyprus. Caroline Finkel cites contemporary Ottoman historians in saying that, quote, "It was Venetian protection for the corsairs, who plagued Ottoman vessels sailing the route to Egypt, which drove Selim to mount a campaign to conquer Cyprus." But as the Ottomans had a peace treaty with Venice, it would have been in poor taste to break it. And that's something interesting here, is that whatever other complaints Christian Europe may have had about the Ottomans, they did not break peace treaties. That was something that they could be trusted to hold on to. So in addition to that justification of, needing to secure their shipping lanes, they also looked for a religious justification for a move on Cyprus. This is a big deal. Like, they're going to break a peace treaty. They need to, have all their ducks in a row and know that they're doing the right thing.
So it's always nice to have a religious justification to what you're doing.
It's always nice when the religious guy's rulings coincide exactly with what you want in the first place. Mm-hmm. So in the Ottoman Empire, the title of Sheikh ul-Islam was given to high-ranking jurists with the power to issue a fatwa, a religious ruling. I've
been told that those are assassination orders that come directly from Al-Qaeda.
They are not always. They can be. I mean, I guess technically, as Salman Rushdie could tell you.
According to Bill O'Reilly, circa 2006, they are for assassinations.
So yes, a religious ruling, it can be about anything. Doesn't have to be an assassination. In fact, most of the time, it's not. And during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and his son, Selim II, one person with this title was Ebusud Effendi. I don't know how to pronounce Turkish names that well. It was to him that Selim turned for spiritual support of a campaign against Cyprus. This is kind of a lengthy quote from Caroline Finkel. She presents this question in full. Like, this was kind of written down, I'm assuming after the fact, and kind of reasoned out how are we justifying this. Mm-hmm. Also, remember that brief history of Cyprus we did where we said it was taken as part of the Arab conquests.
A land was previously in the realm of Islam. After a while, the abject infidels overran it, destroyed the colleges and mosques, and left them vacant. They filled the pulpits and galleries with the tokens of infidelity and error, intending to insult the religion of Islam with all kinds of vile deeds, and by spreading their ugly acts to all corners of the earth.
When peace was previously concluded with the other lands in possession of the said infidels, the aforenamed land was included. An explanation is sought as to whether, in accordance with the sacred law, this is an impediment to the Sultan's determining to break the treaty.
Answer: there is no possibility that it could ever be an impediment. For the Sultan of the people of Islam, may God glorify his victories, to make peace with the infidels is legal only where there is benefit to all Muslims. When there is no benefit, peace is never legal. When a benefit has been seen, and it is then observed to be more beneficial to break it, then break it. It becomes absolutely obligatory and binding.
On March 28th, 1570, Venice received a message.
Selim, Ottoman Sultan, Emperor of the Turks, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, Shadow of God, Lord of the earthly paradise and of Jerusalem. To the Signoria of Venice, we demand of you Cyprus, which you shall give us willingly or perforce. And do you not irritate our horrible sword, for we shall wage most cruel war against you everywhere, nor let you trust in your treasure, for we shall cause it suddenly to run away from you like a torrent. Beware to irritate us.
So it should be clear to listeners, as it was to Venice, what exactly that all means. The Sultan wants Cyprus, and he's not going to take any sort of excuses for it.
This is usually when I click, like, I'll do what I want in Civilization and start building nukes or something.
This is like in Call to Power, when you can select the tone that you're going to demand this city. You can do like the obsequious meek, like, if you could possibly spare this city, I would really like to have it. Or you can be like this, like, give it to me.
This is mine.
This is mine now. So, with these Ottoman goals clearly stated, it was time to assemble another Holy League. The other one worked out so well, they want to do it again. This time with a new pope. This is Pope Pius V, and this is made up of some additional states. So we've got Venice, we've got the Papal States, we've got Genoa, and I think I was mistaken in the last episode when I said that Genoa was part of the Holy League that they assembled for the Battle of Preveza.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea Doria was from Genoa. He was the commander of the Holy League, but I believe he was just serving the Papal States.
Okay.
I do not believe that Genoa was a part of it. So before someone angrily writes to us that Genoa was not part of the Holy League of 1538.
There's going to be a very angry Italian man.
There will. So before you do that, listen to this episode and cool your jets. All right, so Genoa. We've also got Savoy, Tuscany, and the Knights of Malta. Quoting here from Naval Aspects of the Ottoman Conquest of Rhodes, Cyprus, and Crete by Svetopluk Suchek.
As usual, the Pope took it upon himself to promote a holy league against the infidel. Again, as usual, he immediately ran into an assortment of roadblocks. Even though thoroughly Catholic, this alliance was torn by mutual jealousies and long-standing rivalries, especially between Spain and Venice.
So, like, obviously, the Pope at this time in history,
Right.
But at the same time, this does not sound like a fun job. It sounds like he's absolutely tearing his hair out trying to get these guys to do the thing that he very clearly sees, like, we need to fix this problem and you guys need to stop fighting.
I feel like in a weird way, the Pope is kind of like, is it Mike Johnson? Isn't he a speaker? Is that his name? I feel like he's like kind of in that role of like trying to herd lions, essentially, that are all trying to eat you.
But he's also evil.
Yeah, but like he's also bad, which, like, I mean, the Pope, right? Like, you don't become Pope by being nice necessarily back in the day, right?
Certainly not at this point.
Yeah. So, like,
Francis seems like he's a pretty nice guy, personally. Although I know he did used to be a bouncer, I think, at like nightclubs.
What about the Pope before that?
The one who's affectionately referred to as the Nazi Pope?
Yeah, that one.
Well, I mean, yeah, like, credit to the papacy at this point. None of them were Nazis, technically.
We can say that.
They might have agreed about some things, though. The real powerhouse of the League was your friend and mine, King Philip II of Spain, who we discussed at length in the Spanish Armada series. So, see if this sounds familiar from Roger Crowley.
Philip was suspicious of holy leagues, and it was not in his nature to act spontaneously. God's bureaucrat, who dressed soberly in black, read everything, ruled absolutely, thought suspiciously, and acted cautiously, was not one to make up his mind quickly, nor to reveal his intentions prematurely. Whereas Selim delegated the affairs of state, Philip wanted to weigh every detail and manage every operation personally.
So that is exactly what we remember about Philip.
Do you remember him being very involved?
He's very meticulous and very involved in everything, even things he doesn't really have any expertise about.
Mm-hmm.
But he's going to be the one who makes the decision. Also, while you were reading that, Katie texted me in all caps, another Boeing whistleblower died.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I see it's all over Twitter now, so we'll see where that goes.
Boeing, maker of quality aircraft.
I'm sure it's nothing. Legally, we are not insinuating that Boeing has assassinated its whistleblowers.
There is another dead whistleblower, though. It is real. I'm on Twitter now.
We need a whistleblower to blow a whistle on whoever is killing all these people. Whatever division of Boeing that is.
I feel bad for, well, there's your problems, Twitter.
Oh, that's not good. So back to 1570.
Hey, you know what? No Boeing in 1570.
No Boeing in 1570.
No Nazis, no Boeing.
Here we do also have an interesting example of how the two Habsburg branches, Spain and Austria, functioned politically. We talked about in that Armada episode how Charles V had divided his territories. You know, he inherits basically like half the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, I can't do this. I'm going to break this up a little bit. So he divides it between his brother Ferdinand and then his son Philip when Charles retires. So we kind of mentioned how they operate kind of as allies, but they don't always have the same goals.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, we see that Spain joins the Holy League with these Italian states, but the Austrian Habsburgs don't, and they feel no real obligation to do so. But really, even Spain's entry was by no means a guarantee. So Caroline Finkel writes,
Venice was hard-pressed to find allies for the defense of Cyprus. The Austrian Habsburgs and the Ottomans had made peace in Hungary in 1568. The Spanish Habsburgs saw no strategic value in the island and owed Venice nothing. For Venice had failed to provide support against the Ottomans at Malta in 1565.
Venice, I can't help but think of Venice as the little birthday boy of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
They like to get involved with these things. They like to benefit themselves. And then as soon as it comes back to bite them, it's, I'm going to run to the Pope. I'm going to run to the monarchs of Europe and say, please, please, please come help me. It's my birthday. I'm just a little birthday boy.
You wouldn't hit a birthday boy.
You wouldn't hit a birthday boy, and you wouldn't let the Ottomans hit a birthday boy, certainly.
It is interesting, too, that the Austrians are like, nah, we're good, actually, because we actually have to fight them on land, and we're at peace.
Yeah,
so,
we're
why?
We're kind of doing our part already. We don't really need to be in this Holy League.
And then also with Spain, Spain probably has the least interaction, I would imagine, with the Ottomans. They're busy, trying to do their thing in South America.
I mean, Spain is concerned about the Ottomans, but they largely come in conflict with the Ottoman world in Africa. Mm-hmm. Tunis changes hands 3 or 4 times in this span that we've been talking about. I tried to include it in the notes, but I literally could not keep straight who was capturing it when, who was capturing the city, but not the fortress at La Goleta. It's tough. What does Spain care about Cyprus? They operate in the Mediterranean, but not that far east. They really do not care what's going on there. And again, what has Venice ever done for us? They didn't help us at Malta. They're buddies with these guys most of the time. Can't they just pay them off again? Oh, that was the other thing I liked about the Sultan's demand for Cyprus, is that last part where he knows the game the Venetians are going to play. He's like, and before you even mention paying me off this time, no. So through a lot of legwork from Pope Pius V, an agreement would eventually be hammered out where Venice would reciprocate Spain's assistance by aiding them in North Africa when called upon. Another motivation for Spain to deal a decisive blow to the Ottomans was that it was a way to indirectly weaken their ally, the Ottoman ally, France, in the power balance of Europe. Or maybe seen another way, this is Spain playing right into French hands.
I guess if Spain's fighting the Ottomans, they're not fighting the French.
French King Francis I had been very honest about the role of the Ottomans in Europe. Alexander Anievas and Kerem Nişancioğlu include a quotation from Francis in the Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry over the long 16th century.
I keenly desire the Turk powerful and ready for war, not for himself, because he is an infidel and we are Christians, but to undermine the emperor's power, to force heavy expenses upon him, and to reassure all other governments against so powerful an enemy.
Not for their own sake. Like, of course, I mean, I'm a good Christian. I don't want the Turks to be powerful. But talking realistically.
Someone read their Machiavelli.
Yes, this is very, very realpolitik of Francis. So the Holy League spent the middle months of 1570 assembling a fleet to go and defend Cyprus. But the Ottomans had been planning this for some time. By April of 1570, they're already moving troops onto the island, which really is just a short jump across the water from the Turkish mainland.
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot easier for them to reinforce things.
Yeah, Cyprus is pretty exposed when it comes to reinforcement. They are surrounded by Ottoman territory. Much of the financing for this campaign came from Selim's confiscation of church lands in 1568 from Caroline Finkel. That made it sound like he confiscated them from Caroline Finkel.
It did.
So, quoting here from Caroline Finkel in Osman's Dream,
the functioning of the Orthodox Church within the Ottoman Empire was generally unproblematic, as long as the institution acted within the prescribed bounds of its relationship with the state. It had little cause for complaint.
Sultan Selim's confiscation was not aimed at the destruction of the church, but was in line with the continuing efforts to streamline the landholding system in the Ottoman domains.
Once forfeit, churches and monasteries could be bought back to the treasury's benefit, but the effects of the confiscations were uneven, the richer monasteries surviving, while the poorer ones were sold to new owners who could afford to pay the price. That's a really good way of getting the Orthodox Church to be even more in line with like the halls of power in Constantinople. It's like, we can make this a lot easier for you.
Also, is it kind of like impounding someone's car?
Yeah.
This is mine now.
But you can buy it back.
You can pay me for it.
Also, like, what a good opportunity for the Ottomans, though, to be like, hey, if you guys have a problem with this, go talk to those Catholics over there.
I'm sure they'd love to have you over there. But I think what that quote really highlights is what we talked about in the first one, where if you play the game, if you follow the rules, you can do whatever you want, basically. You pay your taxes, we don't care what you're doing, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so here, yeah, we have these churches that, these areas that have fallen under Ottoman domain, and that's a great way to make some money. It would be like with the breakup of the monasteries in England, if Henry VIII had been like, okay, you can still be Catholic monasteries as long as you pay me, double the value for this, and I'm happy to give it to you. By July 20th, there were an estimated 60 to 80,000 Ottoman troops on Cyprus, and the army's commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, needed to choose between the island's two primary targets. He did also have the valuable input of Piali Pasha, who was a former Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, now serving in a government role as vizier. They would need to decide on either the capital at Nicosia or the key port of Famagusta on the eastern coast. And it was decided to take the very well fortified Nicosia first, so as to not leave it in the Ottoman rear. We'll see this in the Siege of Malta, where one of the big mistakes that the Ottomans make is they kind of go right for the fortified city areas, and they don't really clear the island behind them.
Oh, so they're like kind of enveloped constantly.
And so there's this town, I think it's just called Medina, where they don't really realize that there's an actual military force there, and they're able to do cavalry raids, nighttime raids on their encampments, just because they didn't clear these areas. So wanting to avoid that, they go for Nicosia first.
The problem was that Nicosia required 20,000 men to defend its whole perimeter. The city's population was put at 56,000, of which only 12,000 were fit for military service. And many of these were untrained Greek levies. Effective defense also required a competent commander. And in this respect, Venice had been unlucky. Death had stripped the island of its most experienced generals. The best remaining soldiers on the island, Astore Baglione, was in Famagusta.
They mentioned those untrained Greek levies, so two problems there. Not only are they untrained,
Probably unmotivated.
they're also Greek. They're not exactly motivated to fight for Venice, and in fact, will probably mutiny and turn against them as soon as it's feasible.
I would imagine your life is infinitely better under the Ottoman Empire, who's probably going to leave you alone for the most part as long as you pay taxes.
And this is something that's often explicitly promised, where they say, hey, like, we're going to be cool to you if you join us. You know, peasants of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. This left Nicosia's defense in the very incapable hands of a guy named Nicholas Dandolo, who Crowley describes as, quote, cautious, uncharismatic, scornful of the opinions of others, and remarkably unintelligent.
So this man is, I know what he is. I meet a lot of these people sometimes at work. This is a man who thinks he is smart
Yes.
and is not, but he is confident, which is a dumb, confident person, I think, is the most dangerous kind of person.
Yeah, he's going to get a lot of people killed because of that here. So to further highlight really how delayed the Holy League is in its assembly, you know, remember the whole reason they've gotten together is to defend Cyprus. Nicosia is coming under siege and the Holy League is nowhere close to being ready. So Suchek writes,
by the time the ships of the coalition had assembled at Messina, the Turkish siege of Nicosia was underway. And when finally the fleet reached Suda in Crete, and a council of war was held on 3 September 1570, Nicosia was just about to fall.
So the last quote kind of gives it away, but Nicosia did fall to the Ottomans on September 9th, having held out for 40 days. Nicosia is written about as one of the most heavily fortified modern fortifications at the time, because the Venetians have kind of known that this was coming for a long time. Mm-hmm. So they've been preparing for this, but the one thing that they don't really have is the people to effectively defend it. So really 40 days, I don't think is that bad, all things considered, with what they have. They've got this absolute moron in command. Not bad. Their ranks swelled with thousands of men from Piali Pasha's galleys. Ottoman soldiers burst into the city through 4 different spots in the walls.
Again, assuming this looks exactly like 300.
If there was like multiple different breaches into the pass. Quoting here from Roger Crowley.
Around the palace in the central square, the defenders grouped for a last stand. By this time, there were Venetians more intent on killing Dandolo than the Turks. The nobleman Andrea Pissarro sought out Dandolo and tried to cut him down.
Crying, "Here, I say, we have the traitor!" He raised his sword but was felled by the commander's bodyguard. Dandolo wanted to arrange an organized surrender, but it was futile. Fighting yard by yard, the last survivors held out for a while in the upper rooms of the palace, hurling Turks out the windows, until they themselves were reduced to a mound of corpses.
Dandolo dressed himself in his crimson velvet robe, in the hope of being spared as an important person. He was beheaded anyway.
So yeah, I mean that's a common theme with the Turks also. They're quite nice to you if you sort of surrender right away or you don't make it too difficult on them, but it is one of those, if I have to come in there and get you, I'm going to get you. Like that's
I definitely get that vibe in all the reading I've done, is that even if you offer like a little token resistance, they're like, okay, respect. But yeah, if you make it really difficult, then there is a moment where they're just like, all right, we're done here. We're going to just end all of this now.
Like we saw that with the Siege of Rhodes. Like they demonstrated quite a bit of respect for what the Hospitallers had managed to do. And he lets them leave, banners flying with all their weapons. Here, we don't really have that. And again, it's different people involved here. This is Lala Mustafa Pasha kind of has a reputation for cruelty, I guess you'd say. But this isn't the worst thing he's going to do in terms of in terms of this is almost kind of expected, you'd say. A city's being stormed.
I was going to say, like, I don't think this is out of line with what goes on in siege warfare, especially in this time.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to call this like cruelty necessarily. Yes, like terrible things are happening. A city is being sacked.
Most people involved knew that, like, it was going to be the outcome one way or the other.
And probably Dandolo also. That's why he's putting on his fancy dress.
Yeah, he put on his nice clothes for it.
So this head that used to be attached to the rest of Nicholas Dandolo would be placed in a dish and sent to Marcantonio Bragadin, the Venetian commander at Famagusta. In response, Bragadin sent a letter to Lala Mustafa Pasha.
I have seen your letter. I have also received the head of the Lord Lieutenant of Nicosia. And I tell you herewith that even if you have easily taken the city of Nicosia with your own blood, you will have to purchase this city, which, with God's help, will give you so much to do, you will always regret having encamped here.
All right, so the gauntlets have been thrown down.
Yeah, this is like listening to the new Kendrick diss track about Drake.
I have not listened to it yet.
I am a Drake hater, so I'm all for it.
So we've said his name a few times already, but it's worth noting that the Lala in Lala Mustafa Pasha is a signifier that he was a tutor to the Sultan's children. Suleiman's children.
Uh-huh.
Which would have included Salim, among some of the other ones who died / were killed off. And then he also is connected to the imperial family by marriage. His wife was a granddaughter of Suleiman.
Okay, so he has multiple ties to the family.
Yeah, I don't know how the age works out, because Lala Mustafa was fairly old at this point. There might have been a problematic age gap.
I mean, I feel like, yeah, back then that probably wasn't that weird, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably not. I mean, this is a very accepting Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Well, also Lala Mustafa, he was Bosnian. Also, we talked about the cosmopolitan nature of the Ottomans. There's another example. Well, next episode we'll talk about a renegade from Christian Europe who serves with the Ottoman fleet. We've got Bosnians. We'll have Italians. We've got all these people. This is the woke DEI Ottoman Empire we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's really interesting hearing all the stories about the random advisors and people that would be involved and kind of all the administration. How many of them were like, it would be a random Greek Jew who like was part of the, upper levels of the Ottoman bureaucracy. Like, it's very interesting how people were able to do that. Like, if you had a skill or could prove valuable, like there was a job for you. There's
so many people where it's like, oh, this guy's life should be a movie.
Yeah.
Because they start as a barnacle fisherman from the island of Lemnos, and they get impressed onto an Ottoman galley, and then they become like Grand Vizier. The Holy League received news of Nicosia's loss on September 21st and held a conference on the flagship of the overall commander, Marcantonio Colonna. The commanders, one of whom was Gianandrea Doria, the nephew, I think I've seen he's referred to as his nephew and his grandnephew, so he's one of those.
Some sort of nephew.
Relation to the Andrea Doria. So him and the other commanders were largely in favor of turning for home, seeing that their main objective of relieving Cyprus was hopeless. Also, it's really late in the year. It's mid to late September. The weather's probably not going to hold for much longer. The main dissenting voice among these captains was Girolamo Zane, leader of the Venetian contingent of the Holy League. For obvious reasons, he probably feels more of an emotional connection to Cyprus because those are some of his buddies who are being beheaded on Cyprus. Beheaded and worse, as we'll see in the next episode. But even he reluctantly accepts the majority decision.
By the end of the year, both Colonna and Doria will be publicizing their own partisan accounts of the fiasco. If the Pope was dispirited, the Venetian Senate was appalled. Zane would end his days in prison, a broken man, while Philip, who was as responsible as anyone for the humiliating failure, promoted Doria to the rank of general. I am so glad that you said Zane first, because I would have gone full Ohio and been like, Zane.
Billy's brother.
Billy's brother, Girolamo.
So what I think is interesting here is that we laughed last week about how Andrea Doria is like a famous name in history, yet he had a pretty embarrassing showing at the Battle of Preveza.
Mm-hmm.
And then here we have his nephew/grandnephew failing up and getting this promotion for literally nothing. They sailed, they assembled, and then they went home.
And I like that Zane is the one guy that's like, we should fight. And then he ends up in prison.
Yeah, it sucks. We're going to do more research and realize that, like, actually none of the Doria clan ever actually did anything.
Not even the ship. That's why it sank.
We're blowing the roof off. The Doria conspiracy.
The big Andrea Doria industry.
The Doria conspiracy is the next Dan Brown.
That can be a conspiracy theory we make up in permanent. Mm-hmm. We can have our own.
So the Ottomans laid siege to Famagusta beginning on September 17th. Looking at the dates here, by the time the Holy League knows that Nicosia has fallen, Famagusta is already under siege. They've already moved on. And it's there that we'll end part 2 of this series. Part 3 will be the, for sure, final part of the main sequence. We will talk just quickly about the fall of Famagusta and then the subsequent Battle of Lepanto. Any final thoughts on this before we sign off?
Not a whole lot. I'm excited to actually get to the battle, but the background of it has been really fun and interesting to kind of go through some of this and learn a little bit more about the world at this time. So
yeah, and I think the more we can shore that up, like the more interesting it makes Lepanto. Because I think, like any battle, really, just seeing it in isolation can only be so interesting.
Yeah, I think it's much more interesting when you know the characters involved and you know kind of of all the various outcomes, like what do they mean for different groups.
Yeah, so we'll end it there, I guess. Also, I know we did kind of want to talk about this at the beginning. We're recording this on May 1st, 2024. So one of the big things recently, particularly today at the University of Wisconsin, these student protests for Palestine, for Gaza, protesting not just the Israeli genocide, but particularly American universities' investment in Israel and in arms manufacturing. A lot of those protests have turned violent, not by the decision of the protesters. On several of those campuses, you've got cops in riot gear showing up to an otherwise peaceful protest. Now you've got essentially brown shirts being recruited to help break up some of these encampments. Today, there was at least 2 UW-Madison professors who were pretty violently arrested. So yeah, that's something that we're keeping an eye on. We obviously support the student protests, who are really doing nothing more than invoking their First Amendment rights to assembly. It's fucked, a lot of it, I guess you'd say, in a word.
Yeah, looking at what was going on at UW-Milwaukee, it looked like everything there was actually fairly peaceful so far, which is definitely a positive, but they're also doing some really good work there. So I don't know. It is a pretty fucked situation. It definitely makes you feel like you're going crazy sometimes, but it's cool seeing both of our schools stand up and do something.
It's been nice, especially with Madison, from the faculty. They seem to be turning out for students.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that were arrested today were because they were in the mix. They were trying to protect students from the police. So that's good to see.
I did see a indigenous professor lecturing the police today about about how trespassing actually works.
Mm-hmm.
Thought that was a good use of that. It was pretty funny to watch him be like, you want to talk about trespassing and stolen land.
Yeah,
let's do it.
Shout out to obviously the students at Columbia doing good things. The reporters at Columbia, the journalism students. Last night I was listening to their live broadcast, as they're being threatened with arrest, literally in the Pulitzer Hall, I think it's called. So yeah, it's kind of exposing a lot of the well-known, but maybe under the surface contradictions in American schooling and university. Saying what do these schools actually value?
Money.
Exactly. I mean, you've got the students standing against you, and you've got your faculty standing against you. So really, what is a university at this point if you don't have those people on your side? So yeah, I figured that's worth talking about, worth mentioning, if only just to situate in time when we recorded this. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure by next week we'll have 8 more of the worst things we've ever seen happen. But again, keeping the focus on Gaza, on Palestine, I think the protests have done a really good job of that, not taking the headlines for themselves. In many cases, the kids are all right. They're more than all right. They're doing far more than I was doing with my time in college.
Absolutely, they are. There's no way that would have even crossed my mind at that point. So yeah, good for them.
Things might get bad before they get better, but I think there's some hope in that. I think our younger generation is on a good trajectory. All right. So with that, we can sign off here, and we'll be back next week with part 3, where we get to the Battle of Lepanto.